Good evening and welcome to the second part of our two-part series entitled New Directions in Coastal Science and Management. My name is Ed Joyce. I'm with the Oregon Shores Conservation Coalition, and I'll be moderating tonight's event. The goal of this event is to give the coastal community a sense of where coastal science is headed, and we're doing this by having recent graduates talk about their research. However, before we get started, I wanted to say a few words about Oregon Shores. Oregon Shores was founded 50 years ago this year, and this panel discussion is part of the series that we're having honoring with our anniversary events. Our theme for our anniversary is the next 50 years of coastal conservation. So it's fitting that we're winding up our speaker series with two panel discussions featuring newly minted scientists. I encourage everyone to check out our website, oregonshores.org, to view our anniversary events, and you can check out all the cool stuff that we're auctioning off. Oregon Shores has four main focus areas. We address land use issues like where to build and where not to build along the coast. We address climate issues where we help coastal communities understand and prepare for sea level rise. We have an ocean program where we stress the proper management of marine resources, and we educate the public about the nearshore environment. And certainly our most popular program is Coastwatch. Coastwatch involves volunteers adopting mile-long segments of the Oregon coast, and then they report on any changes that they see. And I have to tell you, I've been monitoring my mile in Fort Stevens State Park for the last 4 or 5 years, and it's really a fulfilling experience to go out there every month, walk your mile, note changes, come back, maybe take some photos along the way, take some notes, and then enter that report onto our website. It's just a good way of becoming intimate with a stretch of beach. And like I said, it's a very fulfilling experience. So I encourage everyone to adopt their own mile, and you can do this on our website, oregonshores.org. Like I said, tonight's panel discussion is the second in a two-part series entitled New Directions in Coastal Science and Management. Each speaker will speak for 15 minutes. Then we'll have 5 minutes of questions for that speaker. And then at the end of the program, we'll open it up for a roundtable discussion between the speakers and the audience. Audience members, if you have questions, you can raise your hand. There is a question and answer box at the bottom, and there's also chat. So any of those places you can address questions. Okay, we're going to start now. Our first speaker is Steve Pacella. Steve is an ecologist with the Pacific Coastal Ecology Branch of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency Office of Research and Development. The title of Steve's talk is Observations and Drivers of Coastal Acidification in Pacific Northwest Estuaries. Steve.
Yeah, can you see the screen, Ed?
Yes, we can see the screen. Looks great.
Great, thank you. It looked different all of a sudden. Sorry, thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak tonight. This is the first time I've done one of these sorts of events, so yeah, this is great to mix it up a little bit for me. So, like Ed just said, my name is Steve Pacella. I'm a research ecologist with EPA. I've been in that position for about 2 years now. So you can take the if you stretch the recent graduate thing a little bit, that suits me. I finished my PhD at OSU in oceanography a couple of years ago, and I've been working at EPA since. So my work at OSU was focused on understanding ocean acidification and really how that manifests in estuaries in the Pacific Northwest. So tonight I was going to speak a little bit about some of the work from my dissertation, and then how that's continuing on with my position at EPA now, and just touch on a few of the findings in Northwest estuaries, and then hopefully if I have some time towards the end to talk a little bit about the context of that at least in the national scope. So I'll start with sort of just a general background on what is coastal acidification, in case you haven't heard of this or aren't really familiar with the term, and then go into some of our sort of high-level findings from coastal acidification impacts in Pacific Northwest estuaries, and then again try to finish with how what we're seeing in Oregon estuaries, how that compares to other places around the country. So we can start here sort of with the primer on climate change and changes to the global carbon cycle. So on the left is a simplified diagram of the global carbon cycle, and the red arrows show the human perturbations to the way carbon right now is cycling around the globe. The largest arrow here represents the fossil fuel emissions via human activities in general. And the important thing for the talk today is this arrow here. So about a quarter of the CO2 that's released via human activities to the atmosphere ultimately is absorbed by the surface ocean. And that is, this perturbation to the global carbon cycle in general is observable. So this is on the right here, a quite famous figure from some CO2 monitoring out in Hawaii, where the red shows atmospheric CO2 levels since the 1950s out until present day. But what I want to show is that there's also some surface ocean monitoring right near there where they have been monitoring atmospheric CO2, and that is plotted here in green. And so the CO2 concentrations in the ocean, while they are quite variable and have more noise in them, you can see that the rate of increase in oceanic CO2 is keeping pace with the rate of atmospheric CO2 increase. And whenever the oceans are absorbing the CO2 goes through a series of dissociation reactions, which I won't really bore you with tonight. But ultimately, one of the primary outcomes of those reactions is that there's this decrease in oceanic pH. So as fossil fuel CO2 emissions increase, the oceanic uptake of CO2 is increasing and the concentration is increasing, and that results in this decrease in pH. And that process is what we call ocean acidification. So here in Oregon, we are in a relatively unique situation here where we are on what we call an eastern boundary current. And so we are subject to seasonal upwelling. So during the summertime, when we get winds from the north, that drives an offshore surface current that brings up deeper water that has been cut off from the atmosphere for a while and has accumulated respiratory carbon from the living organisms in the ocean. And so we're in a system where with these seasonal events, there's this natural sort of upwelling of this high CO2, low pH water that is found right along the extreme nearshore areas of our coast, as well as entering our estuaries with tidal advection. So the Northwest in general and Oregon being part of that, we're sort of in the system that's primed to feel the impacts of climate change and ocean acidification earliest, because we already naturally exist at these relatively high CO2 levels and low pH levels. That means any sort of additional change via climate change and via ocean acidification could push the system past thresholds earlier than other places in the global ocean. So this has resulted in the Northwest being this really rich hub of research and energy trying to understand ocean acidification, because a lot of what we're seeing right now can sort of foretell what other places around the world may expect with ongoing climate change. So what I study is coastal acidification. So what I just talked about was ocean acidification. Coastal acidification is essentially the ocean acidification signal driven by climate change, plus all of the other different human activities that happen in the coastal zone that ultimately can result in changes in pH and changes in coastal carbon cycling. So things like urbanization, eutrophication, agricultural development, damming of rivers, so changes in freshwater delivery, all of these different practices that are impacting our coastal zone from the land side can also impact, of course, downstream environments and change carbon cycling and acidification dynamics in our estuaries. And so just based on this diagram, you can imagine, because of all these co-occurring activities, coastal acidification can be this very complex topic to understand. When we go out and we make measurements in our coastal systems, we measure pH, we measure CO2, how do we know, how much of what we're measuring is natural, how much of that is anthropogenic? A lot of that, those sort of relatively simple questions are the basis for a lot of research right now to try to tease those things apart. And that's sort of one of my major research focuses right now. So why are we doing this work? I'll highlight just two major reasons. The first is the fact that we know that acidification in the Pacific Northwest can harm organisms and has already been impacting fisheries. I'm guessing this group is probably familiar with the story from the Whiskey Creek shellfish hatchery, which began to have issues with larval mortality back in, I think, 2007. And ultimately, most of that was attributed to the fact that the water they were bringing in from Metarks Bay was high in CO2 and low in this value we call omega. I won't go into this today, but you can think of omega as basically being the relative favorability for biocalcifiers to form their shells and grow. So whenever omega is high, that's relatively favorable, and you can get these healthy looking juvenile oysters growing. Whenever omega is low, you can have deformations and growth and ultimately increase mortality. That's true for lots of other taxa we're learning as well that live in the coastal ocean, including pteropods, as well as Dungeness crabs. So this is not an issue that is sort of off in the future, even though we are concerned about continuing change into the future. But it is something that we know is happening right now. I think it's summed up quite well by this anecdotal quote from a paper written by an Oregon State University student, Becky Mayberry, back in 2015, where she went out and polled a lot of the shellfish industry growers and found that most of them were already concerned about what's happening to their operation presently. So it's an issue right now from the ecological standpoint, from the economic and the community standpoint. And as a result, states are calling for research to better understand coastal acidification and hypoxia dynamics on our coast. And here's just some examples of some task force reports right now from West Coast states that urge continued work on this topic. So what are we doing in our lab at EPA in Newport? So we're trying to address some of these big questions, and we're coming at that with sort of a multi-pronged approach. So we have water quality cruises where we literally go out on boats into the different systems and take water samples and come back to the lab to analyze that at some of our facilities there to understand CO2 levels and try to use some more refined analytical techniques to tease out different drivers. We also are pretty heavily invested in monitoring platforms right now, where we have these sensors that can actually autonomously sense CO2 levels, pH levels, oxygen levels, and other sorts of metrics that we care about for coastal acidification. And these, we usually have them set to record every 15 minutes, and we'll leave them out there for months at a time. And so it gives us the ability to sort of understand the dynamics of these systems on these fairly short time scales, because we have these 15-minute time steps of data. But then whenever we have them out there for quite a long time, we're also building these multi-year data sets. That's really important, especially from the climate change perspective, to understand how these systems are evolving in the face of coastal acidification. So I'm going to just touch briefly on two of the projects that I've been working on. One here happened up in Puget Sound, Washington a couple of years ago, more than a couple of years ago now. But what we did is we wanted to try to understand how acidification is impacting shallow, really ecologically rich habitats. And so we went out to study 2 seagrass beds in Puget Sound. So the 2 study sites were here with these 2 stars right off the mouth of the Snohomish River near Everett, Washington. And we went out there, we put some sensors out in the seagrass beds that recorded pH and CO2 levels for about a year, and then also went out and did some more refined water sampling to try to understand what are the carbon dynamics like in the seagrass bed, and then how does, again, the climate change impact, how do we expect that to be changing things? So our monitoring gave us these really nice, complex, long-term time series of pH. And again, that value I mentioned, omega, that talks to the favorability for biocalcifiers. So basically during the summer, we saw pretty favorable conditions, and then during the winter, it was actually quite unfavorable with regards to calcification favorability. But what I want to talk about now, rather than going into that, is really just one of the main points that or one of the main results from the study. And that's what we found is that with ongoing acidification and climate change, this addition of CO2 because of our fossil fuel emissions, it's not just lowering pH and lowering omega and increasing CO2, but it's also changing the variability of the chemistry within these habitats. And so I illustrated this with this sort of pseudo-conceptual diagram. It's based on real data, but the curves have been idealized. And this is sort of a single day pH cycle in one of the seagrass beds, where during the day you see high pHs because of photosynthetic drawdown of CO2, which increases pH. And then at night you see you don't have that same photosynthetic drawdown, but you still do have respiration. So you see these nighttime lows. So this is sort of what a typical curve would look like in the seagrass bed in the pre-industrial before fossil fuel emissions were in the atmosphere. And then this is what the curve looks like in the present day. So you can see that pH as a whole has shifted down, but you also have increased the variability. So in other words, the distance between the daily low and the daily high has now increased by quite a bit. And if we look out to end of century projections, you see quite a dramatic increase in the variability of pH in these habitats. And the reason we think this is important is because there's people are starting to study the effects of variability on organisms and are finding that some organisms also are responding to the change in variability, not just the sort of average change in the baseline. So we think that this variability matters for organismal success in the face of climate change. And the sort of most worrying finding of this all was that the nighttime lows, so the times where pH was already sort of naturally lowest, those are the conditions that are predicted to be changing most rapidly with ongoing acidification. So the times that are already relatively stressful for organisms in these habitats, those are the ones that are acidifying most rapidly. And so it's sort of creating these amplified hotspots of acidification through time, even on these very short time scales. So the key takeaways from this study was, again, this amplification of these really extreme conditions of pH and omega. And it turns out that there's other studies are finding similar changes via modeling and observations in other sites. So we think this is a fairly robust finding. And this identifying these sort of hotspots in space and time, it helps to start to think about exceedances of thresholds that are relevant for organismal success, as well as for water quality management. And so we're starting to think that this overlap between these acidification hotspots and actually how organisms sort of go about their lives, that's probably going to be an important driver of ecological impact. So in other words, it's not just that there's a hotspot of acidification in space or time, and it's not just that an organism is sensitive to acidification. It's whenever you have the overlap of those two things, that likely is going to be a place that we want to start to devote some resources from the research perspective and the management perspective to try to understand if that system is actually going to be more vulnerable in that place and time for those organisms. So I also wanted to point out some of the work we've been doing in Tillamook Bay, so closer to home here. You're probably familiar with Tillamook already, but it's a really interesting place to study because it has a very interesting watershed. So you have these 5 major river systems that feed into Tillamook Bay. And then you also have this history of human land use in the watershed via forestry and agricultural practices as well. And so we think that there have been some changes in the watershed, the river chemistry as a result of those. But then the bay is also exposed on the coastal side to seasonal upwelling. So during the summers especially, you can have this advection of this really high CO2, low pH water directly into the estuary that of course can impact the acidification dynamics as well. So we wanted to go there and study it for a variety of different reasons. What I'm going to show is just one very small part of that study, but we think that what we found here is relevant for many other West Coast systems. So to study the system, we've been doing some water quality monitoring. So we have instruments at the northern end of the bay here by the port of Garibaldi. And then we also have sensors down at the southern end near the mouth of the Tillamook River. And again, these have been recording CO2 levels, pH levels, oxygen levels, and a variety of other things since about 2017. We continue to have this sensor running. We unfortunately had to pull this sensor because of COVID-related issues with accessibility last year. But we continue to have this one running. So this is an example of some of the data that we're getting. So this is a time series of pH. This is a time series of that value omega. Again, that's sort of the favorability of biocalcification. And then we can start to compare our observations in the bay to what's going on in the environment. So this is looking at river discharge through time, with the peaks representing sort of our wintertime storms that come through and rapidly increase the discharge of the rivers entering the system. And then this bottom panel is looking at northward wind stress, which is really just sort of a corollary for the upwelling dynamics in the coastal ocean. And so all I really want to show here is that whenever we're making the observations in the system, we can start to quickly identify that our observations reflect sort of the environmental drivers in the system. So for example, when we see these peaks in river discharge, we can see that reflected in the pH record, where we see the low salinity events associated with really low pH conditions as well. So again, these tools are helping us to sort of understand the times where acidification may be most severe, as well as the places, because we're doing this monitoring in multiple locations through the bay. So this figure is a little bit much, but one of the goals of the study was sort of to tease out the role of the coastal ocean in driving acidification dynamics. In other words, how much is ocean acidification, the big sort of climate change signal, how much of that is affecting the chemistry in Tillamook Bay? And then how much do we think the watershed activities have been affecting the chemistry of Tillamook Bay? And I've broken this down by color. So changes in the watershed, the human impacts in the watershed and changes in river chemistry is in green, changes in OA is in blue, and then the sum of those two together is in red here. And I've plotted sort of the change because of these two drivers and then them summed together across the salinity spectrum here. So this is sort of looking at the river end member, and then this is looking at pure ocean water. And you can see we can start to sort of break down in space through the estuary based on salinity, where ocean acidification is the dominant driver, and then where sort of changes in the watershed and river chemistry starts to become the dominant driver. We can also look at this through time. So we can look at the time series from the Garibaldi dock here, and then what we're calling TBO1 at the southern end down here, and start to look at how these impacts are actually varying through time as well. So again, this comes back to this idea of trying to identify these hotspots for acidification, both in space and time. And we can start to do that on the sub-estuary scale, which we're pretty excited about. This is something that hasn't really been done very much before. And not only does it tell us about sort of these hotspots and where waters may be sort of difficult for organisms to be existing in right now, but it also starts to give us a window into the utility of the different management levers at hand. So in other words, how much does the big climate change signal impact things versus sort of local activities? So if the local activities are really important, then maybe local management would be helpful to help out bay water quality versus, how much is the global climate change signal impacting things? That, of course, is a much larger international scale effort. So sort of what we're seeing in Tillamook is that really most of the changes are being driven by the coastal ocean. So a lot of what we're seeing right now is being driven by that ocean acidification signal in coastal ocean waters that are entering the bay. And what we've done is start to look at, when we look at the time series we have so far, of what I'm showing here is omega. So again, whenever omega is high, that's relatively favorable for biocalcifying organisms. And whenever it's low, that's relatively difficult for them to grow in. What we're finding is that about 66% of our observations are below this threshold for shellfish growth and development. And we think that based on our estimates here that we talked about before, we think that's happening about twice as frequently as it used to in the past. So the waters in the bay do seem to be changing with acidification, and that the harmful time, or sorry, the times that are relatively not very favorable for biocalcification seem to be happening about twice as frequently as they used to. So I'm really excited to say that we're able to continue this work right now. We still have our instruments out here at the Port of Garibaldi that are monitoring CO2 and pH as well as dissolved oxygen. And we've been partnering with the Tillamook Estuaries partnership to get this work done. And they've been an amazing collaborator through all of this, really supportive, especially through all the hurdles to get through to keep this going through COVID. I can't thank them enough if anyone happens to be on the call. And we actually have, they received funding to install a telemetry system, which essentially is just going to allow us to broadcast the data in real time so that we and the TEP can see that data in real time and be able to facilitate data sharing more easily. So the takeaways really is that a lot of what's going on in Tillamook Bay right now seems to be driven by this coastal ocean signal, but we're able to sort of get at the hotspots of acidification in the estuary, as well as where in the estuary different management actions may be most effective based upon those findings. So I wanted to sort of just show that the work that we're doing here locally in Tillamook, it's also contributing to sort of our national understanding. So the monitoring we've been doing in Tillamook has contributed to this report and another paper published this year that combined ocean acidification monitoring data from all these different places around the country who are doing similar sorts of monitoring. And we're starting to be able to sort of make these comparisons between different systems around the country and understand the drivers of acidification and predict when different systems may be exceeding thresholds sooner or later. So I'll just close with highlighting the fact that estuaries around the country, they're all sort of facing unique local drivers with regards to acidification, pressure, and vulnerability, but all of them are facing this global atmospheric CO2 increase. So the coastal ocean is going to become a very important, if not already, a very important driver in the future dynamics of these. And that when we're thinking about both the vulnerability of our ecological systems and communities in these systems, we need to sort of think about the overlap between these hotspots of acidification in space and time, as well as the sensitivities of the organisms that we think are prone to impacts from acidification. And if we can start to understand that, we can start to sort of be a little bit more targeted when we think about our management actions and decision-making with regards to these systems. And so that's what we're ultimately trying to move the ball forward on, is how do we think about not just adaptation, but also amelioration in the face of acidification in our coastal systems. So with that, I'll leave it on this slide here. Again, there's been a lot of amazing partners that have contributed to this research. I really want to call out the Tillamook Estuaries partnership. They've been fantastic and so helpful through all of this. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions, I think, for the next couple of minutes if we have time. And if not, maybe leave them until the end. Thanks very much for listening.
Steve, thank you. Nice job.
Yes.
Are there any questions?
Yes, there are.
Let's have a couple.
Okay, we have exactly two. So Henry asks, what technology do you use to store the data and to analyze the data?
Yeah, so the data gets stored locally on the instruments right now, and then we go up every month or so and download the data off of there, and then use some pretty common statistical software to deal with the data there. And it ultimately is stored on a bunch of network drives back in DC.
Okay.
But we're excited that we have this new system coming online where we'll actually be able to see the data in real time as the sensors are collecting the data, and that'll facilitate us sharing this data more widely with partners in the state and in the region.
Okay, thanks for your question, Henry. John asks, not sure I understand how you are able to distinguish between natural drivers of acidification and human-caused drivers, either ocean or estuary, and how you quantify that difference. Are you considering climate change natural or human-caused?
Yeah, that's a great question. And we could probably talk for another hour about how we do that. So the short answer is we have a variety of different ways to do it. One is Well, first, we don't consider climate change to be natural. We consider the increase in atmospheric CO2 since the pre-industrial to be anthropogenic. And so we understand the gas exchange dynamics quite well for CO2. And so we can make some pretty good estimates of what the coastal ocean would look like at lower atmospheric CO2 levels, as well as what the estuary would look like at lower atmospheric CO2 levels. That involves some modeling. That's one way we can pull out the anthropogenic signal, the big ocean acidification signal. Another thing we do is we try to do some really targeted sort of sampling, especially sort of from the land side, where you can go and start to sample in systems that you think are more and less disturbed or at least impacted by human activities, and try to start to come up with relationships between land use and sort of, yeah, those impacts in the watershed and how we think that's changing river chemistry, and then propagate that through the system as well. We also have some different chemical techniques, including stable isotopes that we can use to try to track carbon and nutrients through the system that can be helpful sometimes. But ultimately, it's a really hard question, and that's really where a lot of the science is right now, is to improve our methods in doing that exactly.
Okay,
Good.
thanks.
Thank you, Steve. Good question from the audience. I want to move on now to our second speaker. Our second speaker this evening is Chelsea Batavia. She is an environmental scientist with the Delta Stewardship Council in California. And before I hand it over to Chelsea, I have to say that last April, we held a panel discussion that included Dr. Michael Nelson, who's a professor of environmental ethics and philosophy at Oregon State. And Michael was Chelsea's PhD advisor. What attracted me to Michael was the focus of his research on environmental ethics and philosophy. And I feel strongly that adding ethics to the conversation concerning forestry practices is a great step forward, and it should be pursued. And we chose Chelsea to speak, knowing that she will expand on this idea. So the title of Chelsea's talk is Confronting Complexity, Where Ethics and Science Converge. Chelsea.
Thanks very much for that introduction, Ed. Just want to make sure, does my screen look correct? Are you all seeing the actual slides and not the notes?
Yes,
Yes,
great.
Great.
Looks good.
Thank you for confirming. Yeah, that sets a high bar, no pressure, but yeah, I was going to say the talk you're about to hear is going to be quite different from the one that you just heard, which was great. Thank you so much for that interesting talk, Steve. But I wanted to also thank Ed and Jesse for organizing this event and for inviting me to participate. I'm happy to be here with you all. Thank you for joining on this Wednesday midweek evening on Zoom. I also wanted to start by acknowledging that I am working from the historic homelands of the Marys Rivers Band of the Kalapuya Native Americans who were forcibly relocated to reservations and now live largely in the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Run and the Confederated Tribes of the Siletz. I also acknowledge that I was invited to speak here because I occupy a privileged position in society, having received a graduate degree at a university that was founded on land that was stolen from Indigenous people. I'm aware of the debt that I owe, and it's an ongoing project in my life to reckon with my role in this and many other histories of violence and oppression, and to make amends as I can. As Ed mentioned, I'm currently working as a senior environmental scientist for the Delta Stewardship Council, which is a California state agency charged with oversight of the Sacramento-San Joaquin River Delta in Northern California. But previous to this position, I did my graduate work and a brief postdoc in the College of Forestry at Oregon State, and I am actually still living in Philomath, as I just mentioned. My research background was interdisciplinary, broadly in human dimensions of conservation and management. So the content today is going to be a hodgepodge of some of that work from my research merged with more recent perspective experiences that come from my work in the estuary. But I do want to make it clear that I don't speak as a representative of the Delta Stewardship Council today, so the remarks in this presentation I am making on my own behalf. The last disclaimer, and then I promise I will actually get started, is that I am going to stay pretty abstract and high level today, not so much focused on coastal management or conservation per se, but I think I hope that the themes that I talk about will be broadly relevant across conservation contexts. Okay, quick roadmap. I'll start by just, you might be wondering, why is she even talking about ethics? And I'm not sure that's super intuitive for a symposium or a panel focused on coastal research. So I'll briefly set up why we're talking about ethics in the first place. And then from there, I'm going to go into an example of environmental justice, which has a huge body of research and activism established around it at this point. But I also think, speaking more from my agency experience at this point, that it's picking up a lot of momentum and moving into a new frontier. So that's the new directions in research. But environmental justice is also especially interesting from where I stand, because I think it very nicely integrates science and ethics in a policy space. So I'll talk about that, which is kind of an overarching theme of the presentation, and use that to illustrate what I mean when I'm talking about next bullet, which is moral complexity. I don't think that in the world we live in today, our ethics are very well equipped to handle the sorts of moral complexity that we're facing. And I think we're going to need new ways to understand and respond to this more contested ethical terrain that we're moving in. And so I'm going to talk about moral residue, which is a concept that I uncovered and interrogated toward the end of my academic appointment. And I'm going to use that as an example of the sorts of ethical frames and tools that I think we need moving into this complex world, or within this complex world. All right, so ethics. What is ethics? When I was in high school, when people said ethics, they were referring to classes about peer pressure or sex ed. But that's not actually what ethics is about. It is an academic discipline. It's actually a field within philosophy. Often ethics is used synonymously with the term moral philosophy. For a working definition, I'll start you off with this one. This is from an early 20th century philosopher, George Moore, and he defined ethics as the general inquiry into what's good. So ethics is concerned with issues of what is good, what's right, what is worthy in the world. And often when we think about ethics, I think in common everyday settings, I think what we're talking about, what philosophers refer to specifically, is normative ethics. And so the word normative here means action guiding. So in other words, normative ethics is used, or is thought of as the use of rational inquiry to understand what we ought to do or how we ought to act in the world. So we'll roll with that for a working definition for now, but I'm going to circle back to it in a bit. For the time being, though, I'm going to pivot pretty quickly to explain why we're talking about ethics here in this context of management and conservation. And I'm actually going to step outside of the environmental domain altogether to talk about something that I know we're all familiar with, which is the COVID-19 pandemic. Just to let you all know, I'm not trying to or intending to make any political statements here. This is just an accessible example based on the assumption that I think everybody's probably familiar with the pandemic situation. So I thought it would be one that we could all wrap our heads around pretty easily. So especially early in the pandemic, I was paying attention to the media, and we heard a lot of people encouraging us to listen to what the science was saying. And this is actually an example from a medical journal, The Lancet, and you can see the headline, "Scientific consensus tells us we need to act now." And often this scientific guidance was embodied in the figure of Anthony Fauci, as shown in this fun little cartoon here. The thing is, though, that framing of do what the science says, to me, is a little bit off base, because science on its own doesn't actually tell us to do anything. And to explain why that is, I'm going to break this down a little bit. So I'm going to use Fauci here as the face of science. When you see Fauci, think science. So we hear Dr. Fauci say something like wearing masks slows the spread of COVID-19, and then that gets turned into we should all be wearing masks. The important point is that these two statements are not actually equivalent. There's an intermediate claim embedded, which is that we should, in fact, slow the spread of COVID-19, and that in itself is predicated on additional judgments. For example, the judgment that human life is important. So in more analytical terms, this claim over here that wearing masks slows the spread of COVID-19, that is in fact a scientific statement. That's descriptive. That's within the purview of science. And then we have our kind of prescriptive proposition, our normative proposition about how we should act over here. The critical link in the middle is this ethical value judgment about what we should do, which is based on this belief in the importance of human life, as an example. So in broad strokes, that's that's the dialogue that occurs between descriptive and prescriptive, between scientific and ethical, whenever we're making recommendations, decisions, guidance, and that applies in the management and conservation realms as well. So for example, if we hear there might be a scientific finding that predicts sea level is going to rise a certain amount in some place by some time, and therefore we need to do this. That's what the policymakers say. That's what the decision makers say. It's important to realize that whenever we are making these sorts of decisions, we should do Z, or those kinds of recommendations. Anything prescriptive, yes, we are drawing upon our scientific and technical knowledge, but we're also invoking ethical value judgments. So coastal management and conservation is both science and ethics, not one or the other. So that was the backdrop. Now I want to get back to this, this overarching theme about our trajectory toward increased complexity and explain what I mean. And the example I'd like to use today is environmental justice. So environmental justice certainly is not new as a field. Its origins can be situated in the civil rights movement or even earlier, but I would say it became a much more concerted program of research and activism in the last couple decades of the 20th century. The Environmental Protection Agency's definition, which is widely used, is that environmental justice is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. And I bring it up for a couple reasons. And the first, because there's just a lot going on this front. And so I'm sure been following that this has been a major initiative of the Biden administration with things like their Justice 40 program and the Environmental Justice Advisory Council. This is an example from my organization. We're working on an environmental justice issue paper. There's State of Oregon Environmental Justice Task Force. So things like this, there's a lot going on and really no signs of slowing. So I do think that this is going to be a continuing direction for research and advocacy and policy going into the future, really with no sign of stopping. The other reason that I bring in environmental justice, though, is because I think it's a really nice illustration of this dialogue between science and ethics in policy and management, which I was just talking about. So environmental justice really integrates science and ethics within one framework. And to show how I'm going to use, again, a simple abstract example of the sort of research that happens in environmental justice work. So an example here would be maybe a scientist or a research team is examining how some environmental harm related to water quality, like contaminants or maybe air contaminants, they'll look at how that impacts human health and how those impacts are distributed along lines of race or class or other socioeconomic demographic dimensions. So this here is science. This is descriptive work. We are going out, observing the world, drawing inferences about it, and coming to conclusions that suggest how the world works descriptively. The thing about environmental justice, though, is that this work is done explicitly in the context of understanding inequities and injustices and ultimately promoting equity and justice in the world, and doing that through policy. Now, because of those policy dimensions, in my experience, I often see environmental justice framed really in political terms. So a lot of the work that's done is done in a policy context or policy studies. But I think it's really critical to realize that these concepts like equity and justice, these are quintessentially ethical concepts. They pertain to what is good and right and worth protecting in the world. And so that's what I mean when I say that environmental justice is integrating science within this ethical framework. It's doing science within an explicitly ethical input. I see ethics and politics very closely related to one another, but doing science with an overtly ethical angle and agenda, and then that plays out in the policy sphere. I'll also add that on top of this kind of disciplinary and conceptual integration, there's another type of integration happening across sectors. So environmental justice involves university academics, community representatives and activists, and also government decision makers, among others. So in the academy, sometimes we refer to this kind of cross-sectoral work as transdisciplinary research, not only integrating between scientific disciplines, or between the sciences and the humanities even, but also integrating academic disciplines with partners in other governmental and non-governmental sectors. So, I think this is cool, this sort of integrative work. But the point I'd like you to take away here is that it's also very complex. We're breaking away from this model of research where there's a research team who's asking some question of disciplinary interest. They design their lab or field methods to answer that question, publish their results in an academic journal, and then move on. This model of research is much more fluid and often blurs the boundary between science and advocacy. It's more engaged with community needs and interests, and especially so in understanding and defining what the values are, what the inequities are, that ethics piece. And this is because we realize that different communities have very different needs and challenges. And so as far, for those of us, especially who are working in, for example, government organizations, our responsibilities to the publics are extremely heterogeneous across geographic space. There's not just one monolithic public who we're serving through any given policy or set of policy. Their needs and values are very different. So that leads to my next point, which is that justice and equity, similarly, are not one monolithic thing. There's a lot of ethics, a lot of different kinds of ethics packed into this concept of environmental justice. So I'm showing you just a few pieces here that come to mind. So often we hear about environmental justice, including procedural and distributive justice, the former referring to fairness and fully democratic participation in processes that lead to decisions impacting people's lives, and the latter, distributive justice, referring to fairness or equity in the distribution of environmental goods and harms. And often we talk about procedural justice being necessary, but not sufficient to achieve distributive justice. So but we realize that we probably aren't going to achieve fair distribution of goods and evils without a fair process. And then the basis of procedural justice is recognition. So you have to see these communities who've been marginalized or often rendered invisible to ensure they are represented through these processes. We can add into all of this the principles of environmental justice. So these were developed by the First National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit back in 1992, and still widely cited. This lays out principles that define and guide the environmental justice movement. So other things that we need to consider in how we're acting. So already a lot of ethics there. So a lot of goods, a lot of rights, and a lot of wrongs for us to understand and be working on, a lot of things that we should and should not be doing in a very complex policy space. To make things even more complex, one line of thinking that I really appreciate is broadening environmental justice out to a multi-species context, so thinking of non-human beings and species as marginalized groups who also bear disproportionate environmental harms. So what does it mean to factor them into this ethical framework, into this, this kind of suite of factors that we have to consider in our capacity as moral beings? And then the last piece that I'll mention is that all of this is situated in an overarching context of structural environmental racism. And I would also argue structural anthropocentrism, that word meaning the view that humans are categorically superior to all other types of beings and of life forms. So these down here, these are oppressive societal institutions and structures and practices and stories that have been woven into the cultural and political fabric of our society. And that means that even when we're not in our individual choices or decisions, we're not actively or intentionally trying to perpetrate harm or injustice, we're still participating in systems that do. So an example is just, again, physically occupying the space I'm in, the outcome of a history of Native American dispossession, as well as the dispossession of their more than human communities. That's not anything I chose, but it is still something I am benefiting from and continue to be complicit in, and that has ethical implications as well. So this context of structural or systemic oppression also creates specific ethical difficulties and tensions. So this is a quote that I really like from a feminist moral philosopher, Lisa Tessman, and she writes, "In systematically or institutionally constraining what would otherwise be good, morally endorsable possibilities, the phenomenon of oppression spawns what I take to be a special systemic form of dilemmaticity." And by dilemmaticity, she's referring to this condition where we're surrounded by moral dilemmas. I think probably a lot of you have an intuitive sense of what a moral dilemma is, but to make sure we're all on the same page, I'll give us a working definition of moral dilemma as a situation where no matter what you do, you're going to engage in some sort of moral wrongdoing. There is no morally correct action. And the case Tessman is making here is that when we live in systems defined by structural oppression, like structural racism, we often find ourselves find it difficult to act in morally upright ways because that system is inherently crooked. So there's immorality or injustice baked into it from the beginning. So when we talk about the ethics of environmental justice, I would argue that that's very much part of the picture as well. And in many ways, we are swimming upstream. So we're trying to fix the system and heal these damages, but largely still working within that system. So the way I see it, navigating our ethical lives in this context is a bit like juggling. You know, there's a lot of balls up in the air, and I just named a few, but the implication is that we might drop some. We might not be able to keep them all going. We might often find ourselves in these sorts of dilemmas where we can't fulfill all of our moral responsibilities. So in the environmental domain, often we talk about these kinds of situations involving trade-offs, and we treat them with a certain air of inevitability or frankly, even callousness at times. So that's just a necessary trade-off, we'll say. So I want to provide, just to wrap up, an alternative framing by introducing this concept of moral residue. But before explaining what that is, I'll back up and circle back to our earlier slide about ethics, because I think that this context of complexity really requires us to reconsider and actually broaden how we approach ethics and our lives as moral agents. So earlier we talked about ethics as normative ethics, using rational inquiry to understand how we should act. I'd like to offer a broader framing. This is from, again, a feminist moral philosopher, Margaret Urban Walker, who writes about morality as a medium for bringing our given moral resources to bear in determining how to go on. And I like this metaphor of moral resources because it invites us to think beyond inquiry or rational inquiry. And it's also non-committal in terms of just determining how to go on. That might be some specific action, but it might be something else, like a feeling, for example. And that's what I'm going to talk about with this concept of moral residue. So what is moral residue? Well, in analytical terms, moral residue refers to the moral obligations or responsibilities that are left unfulfilled, even when a person makes the best decision available to them. But that's just words, and really residue is a concept that needs to be conveyed in more visceral terms. So I'm going to stray a little bit outside the coastal context, but still give you an Oregon example, which is barred owl management. Some of you may be familiar with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service efforts to experiment shooting barred owls in a program designed to promote the recovery of the threatened northern spotted owl. And again, I'm not here to comment on that program or the science behind it, but what I do want to do is offer an interpretation through the lens of this concept of moral residue. So let's say that program works perfectly. Spotted owls recover to their historic levels, our objectives are met. I think what moral residue challenges us to see is that that is something far short of what we can call a moral triumph. There's still some moral failure that has occurred there, which I think is poignantly captured in this image, which is the body of the barred owls who are shot in trying to achieve that objective. So the critical thing to understand about residue is that it calls us to respond to our decisions in certain ways, not through our actions, but through our emotions. We know moral residue is there because we have feelings like remorse, sadness, guilt, shame. Loosely, I refer to them as grief. But the big point to take away is that that's the correct emotion to have in these situations, not callousness, not indifference, not smugness or self-righteousness. When we fail to do something of moral importance, and especially when we cause harm, even if with the best of intention and doing the best we can and should still acknowledge that failure and the injury that we caused by opening ourselves up to feelings of grief. And so going back up one more time to the big picture, the last takeaway I want you to draw from this is that ethics, yes, certainly about things like inquiry and action, but it is also and equally about our feelings and calls us to bear witness, especially when we're perpetrating moral injury through our actions and decisions. And when we find ourselves falling into this cold sort of language like trade-offs that are made in this context of moral complexity, we should let our emotions guide us back to the awareness that trade-offs affect people who are particular flesh and blood others for whom we have actual feelings in our insides and in our skin, to quote philosopher Virginia Held. And I use this term people generally, recognizing that people can be human or non-human. And I'll wrap up finally with one more quote. This one's from Aldo Leopold, who wrote, "One of the penalties of an ecological education is that one lives alone in a world of wounds." This concept of moral residue pushes us to open ourselves up to feel those wounds as an inherent and essential component of our morality and our humanity as we're working in this environmental space. And that's what I've got. Thank you for your listening. Happy to answer questions now or later if you prefer.
Chelsea, excellent job.
Thank you.
Jesse, any questions?
There aren't any questions coming in at this time. There is a thank you from Jill that this is so important to hear. I just wanted to say thank you as well, that this is one of those talks that just makes me want to listen and ponder afterwards. Chelsea, this was incredible. I took a lot of notes.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Since there are no questions, I have a quickie. Chelsea, you talked a lot about environmental justice, but at the same time, I heard a lot of talk about environmentalism too. Is there a difference between environmentalism and environmental justice? It seems to be a lot of overlap as you were talking.
Yeah, I mean, there are differences of opinion on this. The way that I conceptualize it, I really think that environmental justice should be the more encompassing term. Environmentalism harkens back to a period of time when we were thinking in many ways about conservation and restoration in a model that's often referred to as fortress conservation. So you protect nature by keeping people out. So things like, pristine wilderness protection and protected areas, which can be really important and effective conservation tools for biodiversity, but is propagating a really problematic dualistic view where nature and humans are categorically distinct. And that's problematic from an evolutionary perspective, from a human rights perspective, from a historical perspective. And we know that. So environmental justice has really been the movement that we've now, I think we're starting to see pick up momentum because it recenters humans in the environment, and it recognizes that there are these intricate connections between humans and the natural world. And so we can't just protect nature at the expense of humans, or we can't, advance human rights issues without thinking about the environment. We have to do both of those things. We're interconnected. I do think that in many, certainly in the policy space where I'm working now, environmental justice has been largely anthropocentric. So it does favor human, it's very focused on human health issues, for example. But I think that there is an increasing push to bring, like I was mentioning, the view of non-human beings, non-human species as another marginalized group who has been displaced and harmed by these, systemic systems of oppression, and bringing them back into the dialogue for environmental justice as well. So I see it as a really progressive framework.
Good, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, let's push on to our final speaker. Our final speaker is Amila Hadziomerspahic. She is a PhD candidate at OSU, and her talk title is Tsunami Risk and Information Shocks, Evidence from the Oregon Housing Market. Amila, it's all yours.
Okay, can you hear me and can you see the slides?
Yes, we can. Looks great.
Excellent. Okay, so I'm going to start us right off because I will probably go a little long. I have a lot to talk about. So yes, the title of my talk is titled Tsunami Risk and Information Shocks, Evidence from the Oregon Housing Market. And as you'll see, I really focus on kind of more acute coastal hazards rather than chronic coastal hazards. So to start, I want to motivate this presentation. The Pacific Northwest, as many of us know, is facing a severe but low frequency threat, the Cascadia subduction zone earthquake and tsunami. In Oregon, resilience to a magnitude 9 Cascadia event is low. For example, fatalities due to the combined earthquake and tsunami could be greater than 10,000 people. And economic losses could be greater than 30 billion. Now, coastal communities in the tsunami zone are especially vulnerable. They will experience the strongest earthquake motions due to their proximity to the fault, be subject to multiple tsunami inundations, and account for the majority of expected fatalities. In fact, all 22,000 permanent residents who live within the tsunami inundation zone will be instantly displaced. It may take 3 to 6 months to restore electricity, 1 to 3 years to restore drinking water, and up to 3 years to restore healthcare facilities. So what can be done to improve Oregon's low resilience? Well, state level and county level efforts can only go so far. Individual Oregonians can increase their resilience by retrofitting their homes, purchasing earthquake and flood insurance, or moving away from high-risk areas such as the tsunami inundation zone. However, whether individuals will take action to prepare themselves depends in part on their beliefs about the risk of a Cascadia event occurring in their lifetimes. So if Oregonians' subjective or their individually perceived risk perceptions underestimate the objective probability of a Cascadia event, that is, if the risk is not salient, then they will likely underprepare themselves. Now, a gap between these subjective risk perceptions and objective risk is plausible given that Oregon has not experienced a major earthquake and tsunami in recent history. The last Cascadia earthquake and tsunami occurred in 1700. So its low frequency of occurrence may lead to this lack of public salience about earthquake and tsunami risk in Oregon. So if this is the case, it motivates an important question about tsunami risk perceptions. Can new information about the risk of a Cascadia earthquake and tsunami narrow this gap between subjective and objective risk? So here in this study, I investigate whether a risk discount is present in coastal Oregon housing markets following information shocks or signals about tsunami risk. Specifically, I studied the housing market's response to 3 sets of tsunami risk signals: 2 exogenous events, the March 11, 2011 Tohoku earthquake and tsunami, and the July 20th, 2015 New Yorker article, the really big one; a hazard planning change, which was the release of new official tsunami inundation and evacuation maps in 2013, and visual cues of tsunami risk, which were the blue lines denoting entrance into the tsunami inundation zone that were installed under Oregon's Tsunami Blue Line project. So using a data set of residential property sales for the Oregon coast, I estimate the effects of these tsunami risk signals in a series of statistical regression models. So let me talk a little bit more about these risk signals before I go any farther. So for the first set of risk signals, I look at the impact on property prices of 2 exogenous events. So when I say exogenous here, because I'll be bringing it up a couple of more times, I mean that the events or information shocks originate from outside of the housing market. They're not affected by what happens inside the housing market. They are external. So the 2011 Tohoku earthquake and tsunami, for example, is an exogenous event, and it had the most media coverage to date that connects the Cascadia subduction zone to another natural disaster. And the July 20th, 2015 New Yorker article, the really big one shown up here on the screen by Catherine Schultz, brought national attention to many predictions and also to Oregon's low level of resilience. If you might remember it, it was actually what inspired this train of research. It went viral in the summer of 2015, and I feel like it was the only thing that people talked about for like 2 to 3 weeks that summer when it came out. So next I want to show a figure of Google searches between 2004 and 2017 in Oregon, specifically as measured by search interest. As you can see here, we have huge spikes during the Tohoku earthquake and the New Yorker article. So combined, this increase in internet searches and media coverage on the Cascadia subduction zone immediately following these 2 events suggests that they did act as information shocks to Oregon residents. So can we see the effects of these information shocks in something like the housing market? Which is why in this first analysis, I use a statistical model called difference in differences to test how these 2 information shocks are realized into property values. Then in the second analysis, I use housing information from the entire Oregon coast to estimate the impact of that 2013 update of official tsunami inundation and evacuation maps. So a little bit of background. In 2013, Dogami produced a new series of tsunami inundation maps with 5 different scenarios for a Cascadia event. The largest of this series, the extra large scenario, became the inundation line for official tsunami evacuation brochures and signage, and it replaced the original and slightly more conservative inundation line that had been established in 1995 through Senate Bill 379. So these figures here show the differences between the original inundation zone in orange and the updated inundation zones shown in blue. Again, in this analysis, I also use this model called difference in differences to test how this map change is realized into coastal home values. Then finally, for the third analysis, I look at a different type of risk signal. So the Tsunami Blue Line project has this spatial dimension that allows its impact to be measured with this property value approach. This project was launched in 2016 and has installed thermoplastic blue line signs on the largest of the 2013 inundation lines on roads in several coast communities, as you can see in these photos. So I use both difference in differences and something called triple differences models to determine whether this project resulted in a risk discount for homes near these blue lines. And I'll talk more about what these models do later. Let's first look at what I did. So the first analysis focuses on the three northernmost counties of Clatsop and Lincoln, shown here in this map in green hatching. The study area in dark green is defined to be within 1 mile of the original 1995 tsunami inundation zone. So the reason why I have such a narrow 1 mile study area is to remove the non-coastal homes with different characteristics from coastal homes from the sample. For the second and third analyses, data limitations prevent me from focusing on only the 3 northern counties. So these analyses extend the study area to all 7 coastal counties in Oregon, given here by the black outline. For the second analysis, the study area is limited to those properties that were outside of that original 1995 tsunami inundation zone, which is not shown here. And for the third analysis, the study area is even smaller and is restricted to a small neighborhood of properties around where those blue lines were installed, which is also not shown here. So I collected a lot of data about these properties. I have property sales data from Zillow. This includes things like sale price, the date of the sale, and structural characteristics, such as the number of bedrooms or the total square footage. For spatial data, I have the tsunami inundation zone, obviously, elevation and location information for natural and man-made amenities. Amenities here meaning desirable features like state parks, schools, or hospitals. So next, let's look at the first analysis's methodology and results. So in this first analysis, I use this difference in differences model to determine the effect of those 2 exogenous events on property prices. So what difference in differences does is it uses a treatment and an event to measure the effect of the treatment, which is the tsunami inundation zone, after the event, which provides new information about risk. From now on, I'll call this effect that we're interested in the treatment effect to distinguish it from other effects. So this model is called difference in differences because we have 2 differences that we're looking at. The first is the difference between the treated and the control groups, those inside the tsunami inundation zone and those outside the tsunami inundation zone. And the second is the difference between pre and post events, such as before the Tohoku earthquake and tsunami and after the Tohoku earthquake and tsunami. So the beautiful thing about these difference in differences models is that they can remove some effects that we can't measure, but don't vary over time, such as shocks to the broader economy. This lets us measure only the treatment effect attributable to this exogenous information shock. So in the model, I'm also able to account for a lot of differences between property sales, such as seasonal differences. And also I can capture how neighborhoods are changing over time, which removes annual changes at the neighborhood level, like storm surges and even the Great Recession. So recall that in 2013, there was that new series of tsunami inundation maps. This map change between these 2 events, the Tohoku earthquake and tsunami in 2011 and the New York article in 2015, causes a problem when trying to set up what I mean by what are the treated groups and what are the control groups in the model. So it means that I need to specify at least 3 models to capture all relevant event and treatment combinations. So next, prepare yourselves. I'm going to show the equation for one of the difference in difference models for model 1. This is the only equation in the entire presentation, I promise. And I just want to show you what exactly I'm trying to estimate when I run these models. You don't have to worry about any math or anything like that. So model 1 considers only the Tohoku earthquake event and the original 1995 SB 379 tsunami line as that treatment boundary. The time range is 2009 to 2013 only, so that the Tohoku event, so that we only use data before that 2013 map change, which presents that problem. On the left-hand side of this equation, we see sales prices. We know all of the sales prices. We have that in our data. But what we're trying to do with this model is we're trying to predict the sale price using all of the information on the right-hand side. The more variables or data that we have on the right-hand side of the equation, the better we're able to predict these sale prices. And the better our prediction for sales price, the lower our errors, and the more we can trust in the results that our model spits out. So on the right-hand side includes all of the data I mentioned earlier. We have data about the structure and data about where the property is located. That's all included in X. The treatment variable here, SB 379, indicates whether the house is inside that SB 379 tsunami inundation zone. And the event variable Tohoku indicates that the sale happened after the 2011 Tohoku earthquake and tsunami. And finally, the quarter and block group by year variables represent those seasonal and annual changes that I capture at the neighborhood level that I mentioned earlier. So what we're interested in this equation is delta 1 on the interaction term between the treatment and event variables. This is the treatment effect of the Tohoku 2011 earthquake on property values inside the tsunami inundation zone given by that 1995 SB 379 line. AKA, this is the treatment effect of that information shock on the houses that are going to feel that information shock. So model 2 considers only the New Yorker event and the largest scenario, the extra large of the new 2013 tsunami zones. The extra large scenario of these 2013 zones is chosen as a treatment specifically because it's the largest one. So I expect that households willing to pay a risk premium to avoid being in the tsunami inundation zone will likely choose to locate outside the entire region of potential inundation. So now what we're interested in is that treatment effect of the New York article on property values inside that extra large tsunami inundation zone. Finally, model 3 incorporates both events and keeps that original 1995 tsunami line as a treatment boundary. So I'm using that original 1995 line as the treatment here because I'm assuming that there's an information lag and that home buyers are placing more importance on this long-standing SB 379 1995 line when choosing where to locate. So in this model, we can measure the treatment effects of both events, Tohoku and the New Yorker article in one model, which is kind of cool. So these are the 3 primary models for this first analysis. Next, I'll briefly show some of the key results. So messy table, really the only thing that we care about here is this highlighted box, and it shows those measured treatment effects for the Tohoku event. So as you can see here by these stars, is that these treatment effects are statistically significant in both models 1 and 3. However, the treatment effects for the article event is not statistically significant in either model 2 or 3. So taken together, these results imply that a property inside the 1995 SB 379 tsunami inundation zone sells for 7 to 9% less than a property outside of the zone after the Tohoku event. So we can call this treatment effect also a risk premium or a risk discount, meaning that there's a 7 to 9% risk premium due to the Tohoku earthquake and tsunami that's felt by these properties that are in danger of the Cascadia subduction zone earthquake and tsunami. So next, I use several different methods to test whether the risk premium of the Tohoku event disappears over time. I run several tests to check this, and 3 out of the 4 suggest that the risk premium does decay. So this plot here just kind of shows the results of these tests. And what it shows is that between 10 months and 30 months after the Tohoku event, this risk premium disappears. So we can say that the results of this analysis suggest that a property inside that original tsunami inundation zone sees a 7 to 9% risk discount after the Tohoku earthquake. But this effect disappears very quickly within 2.5 years of the Tohoku event, meaning that property prices in the tsunami inundation zone return to pre-Tohoku levels within 2.5 years. So the second analysis, took even longer than I thought, but let's see. The second analysis uses residential housing sales data before and after that 2013 map change to measure its impact on coastal Oregon property values. Now that 2013 map update represents a risk signal about houses that were outside of the original 1995 inundation zone, but with the map change suddenly found themselves to be in danger they found themselves to be inside one of the new 2013 inundation zones. Since there are 5 2013 inundation zones, I again need to specify multiple models to capture all relevant event and treatment combinations. So for example, model 1 uses the extra large line as the treatment boundary, and model 5 uses the smallest line as the treatment boundary. So I'll skip the table of results for this one and just show you this plot. So the key results are that only the smallest tsunami inundation zone has a statistically significant treatment effect. And this treatment effect is negative and large. So we can visualize this by plotting these treatment effects for all 5 models with their 95% confidence intervals. So what this says is these confidence intervals show that there's a 95% chance that the true treatment effect will fall between the upper and lower value of the interval. And if the confidence interval doesn't include 0, we can say that the treatment effect we estimated is statistically significant. And as you can see in this plot, only the confidence interval for the smallest inundation zone is statistically significant, which says that there's some evidence that that 2013 hazard planning change is realized into home values, but only in the smallest inundation zone. Now, these properties in the smallest inundation zone were not in the original tsunami inundation zone, but are in all of the new inundation zones. Hence, they're the most vulnerable properties. So we can say that only properties in the most vulnerable situations see a risk discount following that map update in 2013. I don't know how much time I have, but as long as I am not stopped, I will continue. The third analysis measures the impact of that tsunami blue line project that I talked about on coastal Oregon property values. Now let's visualize this, because this was actually a little bit more complicated than the other ones. There we go. So here's a map restricted to a circular neighborhood of properties around the blue line. So the blue line is that small red square in the center of these circles. And it has a circular neighborhood around it, given by this larger red circle for Manzanita, Oregon, is where we're at. Now, the treatment group is given by those property sales, which are these small gray circles inside the neighborhood around the blue line, given by this larger red circle. The corresponding control group is those property sales outside of that red circle, but inside a slightly larger neighborhood surrounding it, given by this green circle. And the 2013 extra large line, inundation line, is this thick blue line that separates houses that are more sensitive to the blue line treatment, houses inside the inundation zone, from those that are less sensitive to the treatment. So let's talk about the models. So first is the tried and true difference in differences model. The treatment variable now indicates whether the house is in the neighborhood around the blue line, and the event variable indicates if the sale happened after the blue line was installed. So we're interested in the treatment effect of being near the blue lines on property values. And what the triple differences model does is it adds sensitivity as a third difference, the first 2 differences being treatment and event. So the sensitivity indicates whether the house is inside the 2013 extra large inundation zone, because we would expect those houses that are actually in the inundation zone to be more sensitive to this risk signal. So let's look at some preliminary results. As in the second analysis, here's a comparison of the treatment effect estimates with 95% confidence intervals for a series of models. I ran 100 models by varying the treatment neighborhood range and the control neighborhood range. I test many treatment and control neighborhood sizes precisely because I don't have a good prior idea for which neighborhood size best captures this treatment effect. I do know that the treatment effect of the blue lines will probably be highly localized, so smaller neighborhood sizes are more likely to pick it up. And models 1 through 50 use straight line distances for the treatment and control neighborhoods. And models 51 through 100 are the same models, except that they use road network distances instead. So what that means is that I use the road network to measure distances between properties in the blue lines, which likely aligns better with how these homeowners are perceiving these distances as they drive to and from their properties and cross the blue line and think about what it means for their house. For example, in this plot, I show the treatment effect estimates for the 500, 1,000, and 1,500 foot neighborhoods. So rather than talking about all of these, really what I need to do is I need to choose one model to work with. And I think my best bet is this model that I have highlighted here, which has a 1,000 foot treatment neighborhood and a 2,500 foot control neighborhood. So what this model suggests is that there's an 8% risk discount for properties that are within 1,000 feet of a blue line. However, I'm not going to talk about the triple differences results because it turns out that they're not statistically significant for the vast majority of the models. So what does that mean? Well, we see that there's some evidence of this 8% risk discount for properties that are within 1,000 feet of the blue line. But the lack of significance of those triple differences models suggests that people are not actually sensitive to whether they're inside the tsunami inundation zone. Now, why could this be? Well, homeowners may not perceive a difference in risk if they're immediately across the inundation zone. They may think, well, the water will reach my property even if I'm outside of the zone because the zone is based on modeling. It can't be 100% accurate. So essentially what this result suggests is that people are attending to the visual cue of the tsunami blue line that's painted on the road, but not to the actual hazard of being inside the inundation zone, which is really cool. Not great, but cool. Interesting, I should say. So, okay, to wrap this up, I investigate the housing market's response to 3 sets of tsunami risk signals. Those 2 exogenous events, a map change, and visual cues of tsunami risk. Now, the potential risk discounts identified in all 3 analyses suggest that at least these 3 types of tsunami risk signals can be salient to coastal residents. So what these results really suggest is that tsunami risk signals may be able to shift home buyers' subjective risk perceptions to better match the true objective risks of the Cascadia event, which in turn suggests that the salient risk signal may be able to successfully induce individuals to take preparedness actions. And given Oregon's current and chronic underpreparedness for a Cascadia event, additional policies or risk signals are needed to mitigate hazard risk. All right, with that, I will just put up my acknowledgments page. I have a lot of people to thank, including, I think, one of the participants, if Pat is still here, because our work on the Oregon Coastal Futures team that was funded by the Oregon Sea Grant helped kind of kick off and inspire and also modify a lot of this research. So thank you.